He said it the way men who have survived a great deal say things they should not have to say. Quietly, without dramatics. Looking straight ahead, the old man was standing at the hardware store counter on a Tuesday morning in September, waiting for a bolt he had asked the clerk to find in the back, and the biker was standing next to him, waiting for the same clerk, and the two of them had been beside each other for about 3 minutes without speaking, the way strangers stand in hardware stores. When the old man turned his head slightly and said it, not to make a scene, not because he had lost his composure, he said it the way a man says a true thing that he has been holding for a long time and has simply run out of room for. My caregiver sells my pills. Hank Dillard turned and looked at him. The old man was still facing forward. His jaw was set. He had the look of someone who has just handed something heavy to another person and is not certain whether the other person is going to hold it or set it down. He said it again, lower, more careful the way you say something a second time when the first time felt too large for the room. She sells them. Every month. They last me maybe a week. The hardware store was called Lundquist's, and it had been on the main street of Deering, Missouri for 61 years. The floors were original wood, dark and grooved by decades of boots and work shoes. The smell was machine oil and sawdust, and the particular metallic coldness of bins full of small metal things. The shelves ran floor to ceiling and were labeled in handwriting on pieces of masking tape that had been there since the Carter administration. The owner, a man named Pete Lundquist, who was the founder's grandson, was the clerk currently in the back room looking for a 3/4-inch hex bolt, and he moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who knew exactly where everything in his store was and saw no reason to rush about it. On a Tuesday morning at 9:10, the store held Pete in the back, a teenage boy looking at drill bits he couldn't afford, and two men at the counter. The first was Hank Dillard. Hank was 51 years old and had been riding for 29 of those years. He was not a tall man, 5'10", which was average, but there was nothing else about him that was average, a fact that became apparent the moment he was still long enough for you to look at him properly. His forearms were ropey with muscle and mapped with faded ink. Going back to his 20s, his eyes were pale blue and direct in a way that some people found disconcerting, and he had long since stopped managing. He wore his jacket the way men wear things they are not performing in, naturally, without attention to it. The Georgia chapter patch on the back was faded at the edges. He had been on the road since 5 that morning, heading west across Missouri toward a land dispute on a property his chapter brother owned, something that had been escalating for 3 weeks and needed someone to stand physically in a field and make a point. He had stopped for a hinge pin, his saddlebag latch had given out 30 miles back, and he had stopped at the first hardware store he saw. The second man at the counter was named Earl Potts, and he was 81 years old, and he held himself the way a man holds himself when holding himself costs him something. Before we get to what happened after Earl Potts said those 9 words, take a second if you're new here and hit subscribe. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels, because what this man had been living through and what he was too proud to have said to anyone until a stranger stood next to him in a hardware store is something that will stay with you. Now, back to Hank Dillard, because he looked at Earl Potts and he did not look away. Earl Potts had been born in Deering, Missouri in 1943 and had lived there for all 81 years of his life, which put him in a category of person who has watched a town change completely while remaining himself unchanged. He had worked at the grain elevator for 38 years, loading and unloading and managing the floor with the authority of a man who knew the weight of things and what they were worth. He had married a woman named Gloria in 1968. They had 2 sons and a daughter. He had coached Little League for 11 years. He had been a deacon at First Methodist for 3 decades and had never missed a Sunday, except for the February his wife had her hip replaced. When he sat in the hospital waiting room with a Bible he didn't open and prayed instead with his eyes on the door. Gloria had died 4 years ago. Earl had lived alone in the house they had shared for 51 years on Birch Street, in the house where all 3 of his children had grown up, and he had managed it with the systematic dignity of a man who had never asked anyone for anything and did not intend to start. He kept the lawn, he cooked his meals, he attended church. He drove himself to appointments until the doctor told him 18 months ago that the neuropathy in his feet had progressed far enough that driving was no longer safe, and he had handed over his keys in the parking lot of the medical building and walked the 2 miles home because he didn't want to ask anyone to come get him. His children lived in 3 different states. They called on Sundays. They were not neglectful people. They were people with jobs and children of their own and lives that had grown up around them. And they believed, because he had always told them, that their father was fine. He told them he was fine every Sunday. He was very good at it. The neuropathy meant pain, not occasional pain. Constant, specific, grinding pain in his feet and lower legs that had been managed adequately. For 14 months by a prescription his doctor had written, and that was supposed to last 30 days, and was not lasting 30 days. And Earl had said nothing to his doctor about this because he had not understood for the first 9 months that the pills were going. The caregiver's name was Brenda Cass. She had come through an agency 8 months after Gloria died, referred by the county senior services office. She came 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and she drove him to appointments and helped with the grocery run and did a light clean of the kitchen and the bathroom. And she was cheerful and efficient, and Earl had been grateful for her in the specific muted way of a private man who does not enjoy needing help. She had begun taking the pills sometime in the first 3 months. Earl had not understood what was happening immediately. He thought he was miscounting. He thought the pain was worsening faster than expected. He thought he was losing his mind in the small, creeping way he feared above most things. It was only when he found the bottle in his bathroom cabinet with 14 pills missing in a single night, a night when Brenda had stayed late to help him after a fall, that he understood. He had understood for 5 months. He had said nothing to anyone, not to his doctor, not to his children, not to his pastor. He had said nothing because he was 81 years old, and the county had sent her, and without her he had no way to the doctor and no way to the store, and his children were in 3 different states, and he was not going to be the reason their lives were disrupted. And because the part of him that had loaded grain for 38 years and coached Little League for 11 and never missed a Sunday was not built for asking. He had been managing on whatever pills were left each month. Some weeks that was enough. Some weeks it was not. On the bad weeks, he moved as little as possible. He sat in Gloria's chair by the front window, and he looked at Birch Street, and he was still. He had come to Lundquist's this Tuesday morning for a replacement washer for the kitchen faucet, which had been dripping for 3 weeks, and the sound of it at night had started to feel personal. He had not planned to say anything to anyone, but Hank Dillard had been standing beside him for 3 minutes, and there was something about the way the man stood, still, present, not performing anything, that had made the words come out before Earl's pride could stop them. Hank looked at him for a long moment after the second time. The teenage boy at the drill bits had not heard. Pete Lundquist was still in the back room. The store was quiet except for the particular creak of old wood floors in the draft from the front door. Hank said, "How long?" Earl said, 5 months. Near as I can tell. Hank said, "You told your doctor?" A pause. "No, your kids." Hank looked at the counter. He turned a hinge pin over in his hand once, slowly, then set it down. He said, "She coming today?" Earl said, "Thursday." Hank nodded. He looked at the masking tape labels on the shelves. He looked at the front window and the main street of Deering, Missouri beyond it. The flags and the truck angle parked out front, and the ordinary Tuesday morning going about its business. He said, "Does she have a key?" Earl said, "Agency gave her one. She come in when you're not expecting her. Once or twice." Hank said nothing for a moment. "Do you want help with this?" he asked. "Or did you just need to say it to somebody?" Earl turned and looked at him directly for the first time. His eyes were gray, and in them Hank could see the full weight of what it had cost this man to say the thing he had said, and what it was going to cost him to say the next thing. Earl said, "I don't know how to ask for help. Never learned it right. I know how to offer it." Pete came back with the hex bolt and the washer, and Hank paid for the hinge pin, and Earl paid for the washer, and the two of them walked out of Lundquist's hardware onto the main street of Deering together, and Hank said, "Walk with me." They sat on the bench outside the barber shop, and Earl talked for 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes more than he had talked about any of this to anyone, and Hank listened to all of it without interruption. He listened to the part about the pills, and the part about Gloria's chair, and the part about the dripping faucet, and the part Earl didn't say directly but that lived in all the spaces between what he said, which was the part about being 81 years old and alone and in pain and afraid to be a burden. When Earl was done, he looked at the main street and breathed out slowly. He said, "I'm not a man who goes to pieces." Hank said, "No, you're not. I just needed—" "I know what you needed," Hank said. "Sit here a minute." He walked 15 feet down the sidewalk and made a call. He came back and sat down, and the two of them looked at the street together for a while. Then Hank said, "There's going to be some people coming Thursday morning. Before she gets there. All right?" Earl looked at him. "What kind of people?" he said. "The kind," Hank said carefully, "that it would be useful for Brenda Cass to see when she pulls up." Earl was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't want a scene on Birch Street." Hank said, "I understand that." He paused. "There won't be a scene." Earl looked at him for a long moment. He said, "How do I know I can trust you?" And Hank looked back at him and said, "You already told me. That's how you know." Brenda Cass arrived on Birch Street at 8:55 on Thursday morning in a white Kia with a dented rear bumper, her agency lanyard around her neck and her phone already in her hand, reading something as she slowed at the curb. She saw the motorcycles before she processed what she was seeing. They lined both sides of Birch Street from the corner of 4th all the way to the stop sign at Maple, parked at an angle, chrome catching the low September morning light, engines off, quiet. The street was not a large street. It was a residential street of modest houses with tidy yards, the kind of street where people know each other's cars and notice what doesn't belong. What was on Birch Street on Thursday morning did not belong. 314 motorcycles did not belong on a residential street in Deering, Missouri, on a Thursday at 9 in the morning. And yet there they were, and the men who had ridden them were standing beside them in the still morning air, arms folded, not speaking, looking at the white Kia that had just stopped at the curb. Brenda Cass did not pull into the driveway. She sat in the car with both hands on the wheel for a moment. She looked at the street. She looked at the house. She looked at the man standing on Earl Potts's front porch. Hank Dillard looked back at her. He did not wave. He did not speak. He stood on the porch of the house on Birch Street with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at the white Kia, and he waited. 313 men stood on both sides of the street behind him, and they waited too. Nobody moved. The September morning was clear and cold, and the leaves on the maple in Earl's front yard had just started to turn, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at something it couldn't understand. Brenda Cass sat in the white Kia for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Then she put it in drive and she left. A man named Vincent Torres had ridden in from St. Louis the night before, arriving at 2 in the morning and sleeping 3 hours in his truck. He was the chapter's point of contact for legal matters, and he had been making calls since Wednesday evening. He had a file folder in his inside jacket pocket that had grown thick in 36 hours. He came up the porch steps after the Kia turned the corner and shook Earl's hand, and then sat with him at the kitchen table for 40 minutes. The recorder on his phone ran the whole time with Earl's permission stated at the start. Earl told it all again. The timeline, the missing pills, the night with the fall, the bottle with 14 gone. He spoke carefully and without embellishment, the way a man who loaded grain for 38 years speaks about quantities and facts, and his voice held steady through all of it except once, near the end, when he mentioned that on the worst weeks, the weeks when there was nothing left, he sat in Gloria's chair and tried not to move, and his voice did something briefly that he controlled immediately and did not apologize for. Vincent closed the folder. He said, "This is elder abuse under Missouri statute. Criminal, not civil. The agency carries liability. The county referral creates a secondary duty of care." He paused. "She will not be doing this to anyone else." He looked at the table. He said, "I want my doctor to know. I want him to hear it from me." Vincent said, "We can do that today if you want." Earl said, "I want." They drove to the medical building on County Road 7 in a vehicle that was not Brenda Cass's white Kia, and Earl sat in the waiting room in his good jacket, the one he wore to church, which he had put on that morning because some things deserved a good jacket. And when the doctor came in and closed the door, Earl told him everything in the same measured way he had told it at the kitchen table. And his doctor, who had been practicing in Deering for 26 years and believed he had heard most things, sat with his hands flat on the desk when Earl finished and did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Earl, I wish you had come to me sooner. Earl said, I know, I should have. A pause. I want you out of pain. The doctor said, properly, starting today. Earl said, that would be something. The county sheriff's department opened an investigation by Thursday afternoon. The agency that employed Brenda Cass suspended her pending review within 2 hours of Vincent's call, which came with a recorded statement, a timeline, a statute citation, and a tone of voice that Vincent had developed over 20 years of making calls that needed to land correctly. A woman from the senior services office called Earl on Friday morning. She was not the same woman who had referred Brenda Cass 8 months ago. Her voice was careful in a way that suggested she had been briefed. She apologized in the precise way that institutions apologize when they are also aware of their legal exposure. And Earl accepted it in the way he accepted most things. Briefly, without drama, already moving on. A new caregiver came the following Tuesday. A woman named Helen, who had been matched by a different organization that Vincent had identified, and who arrived with her own car and her own tools, and no agency lanyard and a directness that Earl respected immediately. She did not try to be cheerful. She was simply competent and present, and she learned quickly how he liked things, and she did not rearrange anything in his kitchen without asking. The faucet on Thursday, a neighbor who had heard in the way of small towns something of what had happened on Birch Street, came by with a wrench and fixed it in 12 minutes. He refused coffee 3 times and then accepted it on the 4th offer, because he could see Earl had already put it on. The sound at night stopped. 3 weeks after the Thursday morning on Birch Street, Earl Potts drove himself to Lundquist's Hardware. He had not driven in 18 months. His doctor had reviewed the neuropathy at the appointment on County Road 7 and again at the follow-up the week after, and with the prescription properly managed for 3 weeks running, the baseline pain had come down enough that the doctor had said cautiously that they could revisit the driving question. He had not made any promises. He had ordered a new assessment, but he had said, carefully, let's see. Earl had borrowed a neighbor's car for the assessment, passed it, and driven himself home, and the drive had been 6 blocks, and he had gone slowly and paid very careful attention to everything. And when he pulled into his own driveway and turned off the engine, he sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel. He thought about Hank Dillard, who had listened to 40 minutes of his life on a bench outside a barbershop, and then made a phone call, and then stood on his porch on a Thursday morning and looked at a white Kia until it left. He had tried once to find a way to thank him properly and had not found the words for it, because there were no words for certain kinds of things. And he thought Hank Dillard probably knew that and was not waiting for them. He got out of the car and went inside and called his son in Denver and his son in Charlotte and his daughter in Portland. And he told them the true version of what had happened over the past 8 months. And it was a hard phone call in all 3 cases. And all 3 of them were on a plane within 48 hours, which he had not asked for and which moved him in a way he did not show them when they arrived and did not need to. He showed it by making breakfast. The good dishes, the ones Gloria had picked out, the ones with the blue rim that had survived 5 decades of family mornings. He made eggs and toast and coffee, and he set the table for 4. And he sat down with his 3 children in the house on Birch Street, and he ate a meal that did not hurt him to eat. And outside the maple tree on the front lawn had gone full red in the October cold, and the morning light came through the front window and lay across the table the way light does in a house that is lived in and known. And Earl looked at his 3 children, and he was, for the first time in a long time, entirely present in the room. Hank Dillard was 60 miles west of Deering when his phone rang, on the same day, which was a Friday. He was still heading toward the land dispute, which had not resolved and was going to need him to stand in a field and make a point, probably more than once. He answered without looking at the name. A voice he recognized said, "It's Earl." Hank said, "Earl, I drove myself to the hardware store this morning," Earl said. Hank was quiet for a moment. "Lundquist's?" he said. "Lundquist's. Get what you needed?" "I did." The highway went on in front of Hank and behind him, flat and long in the September light. Earl said, "I want you to know I'm not a man who—" He stopped. He started again. "I don't know how to say the thing I want to say." Hank said, "You just said it." A longer pause. "All right," Earl said. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. Hank let the call end and put the phone away and rode west, through the September morning with the flat Missouri land on both sides of the road and the sky very large above it. And he thought about an 81-year-old man who had coached Little League for 11 years and never missed a Sunday, and had loaded grain with his hands and known the weight of things and had sat in his wife's chair in a quiet house and tried not to move. He thought about what it costs a man like that to say 2 sentences to a stranger. He thought it was about the most dignified thing he had ever witnessed. The road opened up, and he rode on, and behind him on Birch Street in Deering, Missouri, a maple tree blazed red in the October morning, and a faucet that had dripped for 3 weeks was silent, and an old man sat at a kitchen table with his 3 children and ate breakfast off the good dishes with his hands that did not hurt him. And he was home. There are people in this world who take from the ones who cannot easily fight back, who count on silence and pride and the particular loneliness of the old to protect them, who have done it before and will do it again unless someone stands in the road. Sometimes that someone arrives on a motorcycle. Sometimes they line both sides of a quiet residential street on a Thursday morning and they don't say a single word, and they don't need to. If this story reached you, if you believe that no one who has spent 81 years being decent should have to spend 1 week sitting still in a chair because someone stole what they needed, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. If you know someone who is aging alone and carrying something they haven't said to anyone, type Birch Street in the comments. I read every single one.